Okay. Now today I want to talk about, I guess this will be well, no, this isn't the last painter we're going to talk about. Today I want to talk about Pablo Picasso anyway. I don't want to talk about Pablo Picasso too much. I mostly want to look at the paintings. I want to explain some things about the paintings. I think we've seen enough now, both about the history of painting and about the sort of modernist movement that he's a part of, that we have some tools now to appreciate what he's doing. Let me see, let me look on that, my little share screen deal here and see what I got. Do I say that? Yeah, I do. I say, I title it. I have to come up with some kind of silly title, right? I always do that too. Picasso, I call this, you know, Picasso genius meets style, meaning that Picasso obviously has a genius which is sort of transcendental and transformational. There's no way that he would have been anywhere, any time and place, I think, and not been creative, very creative, and probably in some sort of visual way. He's you can just look at Picasso and see this visual animal, and so he's a genius. He's a natural born genius, and I think that will come out today. He's a kind of force of nature. That's another sort of phrase to think about using, talking about Picasso. Maybe I'll call him a force of nature. But like all artists, like all humans, like all historical figures, he is in a context. And in his case, in Picasso's case, he is in a very attenuated conceptual context coming into the art scene in Paris in the beginning of the 20th century. All these things have been happening. He's a sponge. He quickly starts absorbing things. The thing about Picasso, we talk about Picasso going through different periods, and we'll look at these periods a little bit today. Sometimes when I teach this in class, I work hard on everybody getting the periods right. It's just a way to structure things. But we're going to take a chronological look at some of Picasso's paintings today. But what I was saying is he has these periods that he goes through, but he never loses anything. He only adds stuff in. And that could be anything from style, from particular stylistic gesture that he has, to specific content like the harlequins or the bulls or the guitars, images and forms that he comes back to again and again. And then he even has styles. We associate him with the Cubist style. He paints many paintings in a non-Cubist style. He also has a serious uh, oeuvre of surrealist paintings, as well as these paintings, the neoclassical paintings, he called them. Uh, and once he becomes a mature artist, I mean, and he matures fast. Once he becomes a mature artist in his 30s, 40s, he might paint a surrealist painting and a cubist painting and a neoclassical painting and something else, a naturalistic portrait on paper, all in really the same day. I mean, it's not that he sort of slowly is working in one style then gets to another. He'll work in multiple styles, all of them having all of this content, all of this stuff. Now, while we're on his creative process, probably the most notorious thing about Picasso in our age of awareness and vigilance of everybody's sexuality, then needless to say, Picasso attracts attention, because what Picasso did was wear people out and kind of throw them out. Now, I mean, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to get into that too much. I'm not an apologist for Picasso. He's not a nice person. He doesn't treat his women well. I think it's a little reductive merely to see him as this sort of misogynistic monster. And I think people forget all the many, many years that he spent with those 4 or 5 women living the life. I imagine, um, chilling around the bungalow with Picasso was probably pretty good. But anyway, um, but I think that really what we want to look is just at the paintings. So let's do that. He's Spanish. He lived most of his life in France. He lived in Paris in the city as a young man. Later, also in Montmartre, he had a studio. But he also would buy, eventually, Picasso, by the time Picasso was in his 40s or 50s, Picasso would just buy a chateau or a mansion or a big farmhouse someplace out in the French countryside and start working. He'd clear the furniture out of the place for the most part, and he'd start working. He'd fill the place up with art. And I mean, and the place that was like everything else with him, he'd fill it up with art until he just needed somewhere else. He didn't like to get rid of his art. He got rid of it as he needed to. Uh, he left over 50,000 pieces. I mean, this includes also, remember also, we're going to look at paintings today, but Picasso is a multimedia figure. He does sculpture. He does sculpture that's actually very significant. I'm going to do a modernist sculpture. That's the last modernist thing I'm going to do. And I'm thinking I'm going to include Picasso perhaps even in that. And he works in etching. He makes ceramics. He makes really nice ceramics. He works in a lot of different mediums. He even takes photographs. Um, but he paints, and he does it every day, and he does it every day, literally until the day that he dies. Some people think that the art from the later years isn't as interesting as the art from the early years. I think that's true in as much as the art from the early years was so groundbreaking, and we really, and you know, in the later years we have the benefit of experience, but the arts are recognizably Picasso's. Picasso is one of these artists, by the way, who is instantly recognizable. When you see a piece by him, even if you've never seen it before, if you're familiar enough with his work, you will instantly recognize it as Picasso. I think for certain kinds of creative geniuses, that's really one of the marks of that kind of genius, that really they're unique and their work just is unmistakable. Again, he comes pretty much out of the box, you know, extremely talented painter. I do want to say he moves, then the third bullet point, as I said, he moves from style to style, mixing them together, and he never jettisons anything. So when we talk about his periods, that can be sort of misleading because most normal people have a period where they're doing one thing and then a period where they're doing something else. And he just keeps building, really. He's a founder of Cubism. That was a collective affair. Georges Braque and he were the main thinkers of Cubism. Juan Miró, also a really interesting painter and also a really important surrealist painter, as well as a Cubist painter. So there are these three, the one French and the two Spanish, Picasso and Miró, surrealist painters, Cubist painters, I'm sorry. Thinking of Dali, also Spanish, a surrealist painter. Um, and Cubism, let me say, I talk about it in that Einstein video that I'm posting this week as well. Cubism, the idea that they got from Einstein was that that a lot depended on how you looked at a thing, and that light was bent. And so what the Cubists would do, particularly analytic Cubism, the early part, when they took this theory kind of seriously, and they would do a lot of studies of the object. They have still lifes, they have portraits, the Cubists painted all the stuff that painters paint. But they would study it from a lot of different angles, and they would try and use this kind of facet approach. One of those periods is called the crystal period because he has these little crystalline sort of triangles that he's using. So he's a tremendous talented painter who is in this modernist context, and he's just has a huge piece of it. He's doing all kinds of different styles, and he's right at the forefront. He wants to be right at the forefront, hugely ambitious. When he was 13, there's a whole lot of these. His father decided it was time for him to go to art school. His father was a professional artist himself who had been teaching the boy, and he had to draw some. As you can see, you've got charcoal and on paper and pencil on paper drawings here. And there's a lot of these, but again, you can see these are classical studies. So this is age 13. So what is that? That's around 7th grade, maybe starting junior high. This is how Picasso drew. When he's 15 years old, he paints this painting. I mean, you know, the thing is, and this is true of poets as well as painters. I mean, if you're going to break conventions, I'm not exactly sure why, but it just is true that artistic geniuses who break conventions tend to have a really, really solid grasp of the conventional forms, the conventional techniques. There's something about having that grasp that is necessary before one breaks it. People always make that mistake. I think philosophy is really probably like that too. And I think, again, people always make that mistake and they want a sort of fast way through, a fast way to doing something new, but the only way is to work through it all. Again, this is the way that Pablo Picasso painted. This is a big canvas, and he makes a number of them. And the other thing about Picasso is he makes many paintings a year. He makes many paintings a week. And so that's another thing that ordinary human beings, I think, have a hard time appreciating. Also from 1896, when he's 15 years old, he makes this painting. And it has often been remarked that this painting is a museum quality painting, just, standing alone, his portrait of Titi Peppa from 1896. He went to Paris. He went there with a beloved friend. And that man who is pictured in the painting on the left subsequently commits suicide. And that was, of course, rather traumatic for Picasso. They had gone up there together to Paris and made their way. And he went into a period called the Blue Period. This is taking color awfully seriously. He just decides he's going to work with blue because blue is just evocative for him. And after that, he works his way out of it by working through the Red Period. That painting on the right, the old man with a guitar, is an iconic Blue Period painting. And so blue, the color blue, just expressing the kind of sadness that he was feeling. And they are melancholy paintings. It gave way to red. So you have a blue painting on the left, and then you see him kind of waking up, and that Harlequin figure, because his friend Apollinaire, the poet, took him out. He was an absurdist poet and a French symbolist poet. And he showed Picasso these clowns dressed like Harlequins in the street, and Picasso was fascinated by the Harlequins. They became a real symbol for him. This beautiful painting, Boy with a Pipe from 1905, again, a large painting, Picasso, 23 years old. So Cubism, as they say, Picasso and Georges Braque invent Cubism together, sort of sitting over coffee in a cafe. They're thinking about Einstein. They're also thinking about Paul Cézanne, though. I mean, if you're talking about influences on Cubism, one is certainly Einstein, and I explain that a little. I'll talk about it a little bit more. But the other one certainly is Cézanne. Cézanne, who independently came to the idea that what you really wanted to give solidity to objects was to look at their underlying shapes, a cone, a barrel, a square that you see in the object that you're painting, and sort of bring those out. And Cézanne's paintings then have a kind of heft. The objects in his paintings have a kind of gravity. And this is what makes Cézanne sort of a leader of postmodernism. And Picasso was fascinated by Cézanne. He loved the effects that Cézanne achieved, and he tried to get them. They worked to achieve those effects. They worked similarly, that is to say, obsessively. Cézanne also works on the same paintings over and over and over. And then Albert Einstein and the theory of relativity, that space and time are not absolute, that there is one thing which is space-time, and it curves around massy objects, and this gravity bends the light. So there were a lot of misinterpretations of this at the time, including sort of silly relativism about values and things, but that wasn't what the Cubists were into. The Cubists took this idea of the impact that multiple perspectives had seriously. I think sort of like the Impressionist, I'm just thinking about the Impressionist technique of not blending colors. And you got this Cubist technique of trying to sort of fractalize the picture, or break the picture up into these flat bits, but the flat bits that are adjacent to each other are actually ones painted from different angles. Okay, so that's sort of technically, that's part of it. And then you'll notice sometimes in the Cubist paintings that there'll be little hatches and things, sort of little spaces between the various Cubist spaces, the triangles and wedges and things, which softens it out and makes it easier to see the underlying figure. Part of the interest in looking at Cubist paintings is that when you first look at it, you see a bunch of, cubes and lines and angles. But then as you look at it longer, the form comes out. Sometimes the forms are quite exquisite, which is a really interesting effect that Picasso is really good at getting. When we talk about, so that's analytic cubism, the really dense stuff. And synthetic cubism, they pioneered collage, mixed media. Again, this was a collective enterprise, Picasso not the only one doing it. and cutting things out from newspapers. And of course, Matisse, Picasso's great friend and rival, was also a master of collage. So they were always competing with each other in these things. So analytic cubism and synthetic cubism. Analytic first, and that's the really busy work with fractalizing the picture, and the synthetic cubists pieces are highly abstract, but tend to have more space. His famous self-portrait and his portrait of Gertrude Stein. Somebody said to Picasso, "It doesn't look like Gertrude Stein," and or what he said, "She doesn't look like your painting," and Picasso said, "She will." So that's the interesting thing that he said. Of course, Gertrude Stein, the modernist writer, a main patron with her brother Leo of Picasso, helping to support him very much. This was the painting that broke things through for Picasso and made him rich and famous. Not until I think it was 1916 when he finally showed it in public. He didn't take it out of his studio until then, because it was so controversial. You see it's a movement towards Cubism. You see on the right, the faces of the two women on the right are strange abstractions. They are actually inspired by African masks. This period is also sometimes called the African period, because Picasso is very interested in these African masks from West Africa, from Gabon, and these Dahomey masks that he's looking at. Another thing that the Steins are collecting. And another issue of modernism is bringing in all these elements from other cultures, and particularly folkloric elements from other cultures, notably Africa and Asia, but also indigenous North Americans even get into the business of modernist art. So sometimes that's referred to as Orientalism, and that's another element. Of course, Picasso, as I say, always picking things up. In fact, you could notice several different styles in the way that these women are depicted moving from left to right, with the two in the middle in a sort of traditional kind of Spanish style, but the one on the left looking more kind of Byzantine. And notice the very impossible body posture of the squatting woman on the lower right, and the way she's the way her head is looking at the viewer. Of course, Picasso, a big fan of Velázquez, and fascinated with this notion of the figure in the painting gazing at the viewer, very common thing. Again, you see Cézanne on the left, some years later, Picasso on the right. Picasso trying to get that, both the sort of color and the mood of Cézanne, who seemed to have sort of elevated Impressionist painting up a notch to everyone. Here you have an analytic cubist portrait. These are large. Ambroise Vollard was a art dealer. These are painters, art dealers, girlfriends. He liked to paint people that he knew, and he liked to paint from life. Guitar player. So in this one now, again, first you see a completely abstract assemblage of angles, but then you see the head, and you see then the shoulders. The guitar, you've got a circular space in the middle, so that's giving you a clue. And then pretty soon you start to put together, the right arm is strumming, the left arm is fingering the fretboard, and you can see the chair that he's sitting on. And slowly and surely, a lot of elements of the guitar player start to come out. And there are quite a few of these paintings, and that's one of the things that makes them interesting to look at. Synthetic cubism, a lighter palette, again, with things pasted sometimes and glued, also some things sticking up out of the, off the surface. A lot of modern art that you see today, installation art, found art, assembled art, is really these people in the early 20th century pushing the boundaries and questioning really what art even was. And of course, people like Duchamp as well, other elements of the modernist movement that we're not looking at, because we just don't have time. And in addition to the Cubist paintings and paintings that he does that are not in the Cubist manner, he also has a solid number of these surrealist paintings. that are just very similar to things that Dali does. And some of these are really just extraordinary paintings, done at the same time as these neoclassical paintings. He calls them his neoclassical paintings. I guess so. But it's the solidity of form and the composition that he uses is another thing that fascinates him. He has many of these neoclassical paintings. I think they're overlooked. I always think when I see some of these really more far out neoclassical or surrealist paintings, well, maybe I could get one of those, but no, Picasso is not available. Another neoclassical, what he would call neoclassical. And again, notice how interested he is in heft, the heft of the figure, the density, the weight. At the same time, so here's 1921, here's 2 years later. I have to repeat too, but each one of these years has dozens and dozens of paintings. Every year he makes dozens and dozens of paintings. In 1937, he does Guernica. There was the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, and the right-wing forces were the royalists. They were backed by the Nazi regime in Germany, which wanted to check out and test out its bombers. So a Republican town, Guernica, a small city, was bombed on behalf of the royalist forces in the Spanish Civil War. A great atrocity that inflamed world opinion. And so this is a huge painting. I'm looking at this slide and I'm not seeing the resolution that I would like, but I guess you get the picture. Obviously the city being bombed, it's very long and high. And Picasso said that he didn't want Guernica to be in Spain as long as Franco was the dictator of Spain. And it wasn't until after Franco's death in the 70s, the same time as Picasso's death, roughly, that Guernica was returned to Spain. It was in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City on a landing. And I grew up in Rochester, New York, and graduated from high school in the 70s. And I remember going to New York and going to MoMA a couple times and seeing Guernica when I was growing up. If I went on a trip to New York City, we'd go to the Met, we'd go to MoMA. And I saw Guernica any number of times as it hung in New York before the death of Franco in the 70s when it returned to Spain. I'm not sure what museum it's in Spain. There is a big Picasso museum in Spain. It might be there, or it might be in the Prado. I really don't know. And he does a lot more paintings. I'm just going to now show you, just to finish up here. He was fascinated by Las Meninas. We talked about that in the Baroque art part 1, the paintings of the South part, where he did Caravaggio and Velázquez. And he has many, many studies and many, many paintings of Velázquez. Here you can see of Las Meninas. I used this one in the beginning too. He has quite a few of these and many studies and drawings. Here you see a couple more of his studies of Las Meninas. I'm not sure what's going on with that animal in the front, but there's always something going on with him. The one on the left, of course, you can see Velázquez standing there looking at the king and queen with the easel. Then you look one on the left and you sort of get it. Lots of self-portraits. I'm interested in the one that he did when he was 90. He, of course, very dramatic to say the least. And he has a lot of these older paintings, late paintings of his. Again, his artistic process was very erotic and always had to involve a woman in a particular kind of relationship. And when he did get to be elderly, as I think an intelligent person does, he started to feel some of the, what is the feeling? It's not exactly humiliation. I'm not sure what the word is that I'm looking for. He started to rue himself and see himself, I think, a little bit. And so that amazing painting on the right there, 90-year-old person really expressing himself. And he looks great. Look at paintings, look at photographs of Picasso in the 80s and 90s. It looks amazing. I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. Okay. So in Picasso, we see a whole bunch of stuff, and the stuff we've been talking about, this post-impressionist, modernist environment. And Picasso, I think, out of all of the painters, and there are very many, and many of them are really excellent painters, Matisse, of course, Cézanne, of course, but many others as well. I think Picasso really stands out, both for his productivity, and he is kind of a force of nature, his unmistakable style, which lasts through all the permutations of his experiments with genre and all the periods that he goes through. And just he is visually arresting. He is just an endlessly charismatic artist. My experience is that some people don't see it, and that's okay. But those with eyes to see, take a look at Picasso, because there's endless amounts of stuff to look at, and he's always interesting. He's always doing something astonishing. So, all right, what I wanted to do was mostly look at pictures. There's a lot more where that came from. So if you want to write about Picasso this week, if I were you, I'd do yourself a favor and take a look at as many pieces, as many works as you can, until you start to get a feel for his personality and the way that his personality is expressed through his technique and his style. All right, I'll see you next week.